Nazywam się Wes i od 3 miesięcy uczę się polskiego. Jest to trudne, ponieważ polski nie jest łatwym językiem do nauki. Ale idzie mi coraz lepiej każdego dnia i jest to bardzo satysfakcjonujący proces. That one's a hard word. Teraz mogę tworzyć podstawowe zadania i prowadzić podstawowe rozmowy. Na przykład, kiedy idę do sklepu spożywczego lub zamawiam jedzenie w restauracji. Dziś chcę opowiedzieć moją przygodę z nauką języka polskiego, mój ogólny proces i największe problemy. As you can see, that was not the easiest thing to do. I had to obviously do it with the script, and just the pronunciation of everything is really hard. I had to do a bunch of takes just so I can get it right. So here are some of the biggest issues that I've seen learning Polish, just for me personally. A lot of the verbs in Polish sound the same. The base forms like płacić or płakać, right? Płacić means to pay, płakać means to cry. And if you see the way they're written, and if you see them conjugated, it gets like even more confusing. But on top of that, they have two forms of verbs for an action done or an action undone. And this concept is actually very similar to past tense in Spanish. For example, decir, which means to say, right? You have dije, which means I said it at that one moment. And then you said decía, which means I always used to say something. It's kind of the same concept in Polish as well. They don't just have it for past tense, they have it for all of the tenses. Because Polish is a very consonant heavy language, and they have so many different forms of C, of Z, of S. If you don't really pay attention to how all of the different sounds sound, a lot of the verbs can all blend together. I'm just trying to learn the base form of all the verbs to systematize it in my head to eventually be able to conjugate them in the future. That's how I learned Spanish, so I'm kind of using the same process. What's the word for to raise kids? It's like vivo, vime, something like that. They don't have any other letters. They just put a bunch of consonants in the words to make all of these verbs. Over time, I can finally see the difference between them, but if you're just getting into the language, it's very, very confusing. One of the cool things about Polish, though, is that just like Spanish, they have reflexive verbs. So in Spanish, you have like sentarse, sentirse, enamorarse, which is a concept that we don't have in English. But in Spanish, you have to change the se depending on who's doing it. So me siento, te sientes, se siente. But in Polish, thankfully, you just use the word się for everything. So if it's ja, or ty, or wy, or me, every time there's a reflexive verb, you always just use się. So that makes Polish, I guess, a little easier. Something quite confusing in Polish is that not only do you have the undone and done versions, you have a bunch of prefixes that could be added to a word to change the meaning slightly. So let's take the word płacić, right, which means to pay. So you have zapłacić, zapłacić, opłacić, and just regular płacić. If you look up the definition in the dictionary, all of them mean pay, but they are pay in different contexts. So this is why it helps having Polish friends around for them to explain it to you, because if I were trying to learn this by myself, I would be so lost all the time. Płacić means to pay, undone. Zapłacić means to pay, done. Opłacić means to pay something like your rent or a fine. And zapłacić means to pay something that you owe or are due to pay. Confusing, I know, right? Like, I don't know why they can't use just płacić for all of them, but that's just how Polish is. I'm trying to see if there's like a universal rule between all of the verbs, the o prefix or za prefix, if that has a similar effect of all of the words. And it seems like that is not the case. So you just have to memorize all of the words and what they mean. And I think the core of why Polish is so difficult is because there are just so many rules. For every rule that you learn, there are 10 rules behind it. So I found a PDF file of Polish grammar in a nutshell. Before I found this one, I found a Spanish one, and the rules for grammar were only like 10 to 12 pages long. The rules for Polish grammar are 95 pages. And that's why it's so difficult, especially in the beginning, because as soon as you think you have an understanding of Polish, oh, but wait, there's actually 2 or 3 rules on top of that you haven't learned yet, which is very, very discouraging. And Polish is really interesting because it seems like every word has a form of it that can mean one specific thing related to that word. So it's a lot more nuanced of a language, and it's a lot more descriptive, so you can accurately, like exactly say what you're talking about, but it does seem overly complicated, and that makes this language extremely front heavy. I think it's going to be common for a lot of people to be studying this language for 6 months to a year, and very difficult to see any real progress. So one of the rules that's confusing to me, let's take verbs that end with an AC. So let's take czytać. If you were to conjugate that, so ja czytam, ty czytasz, and on, ona czyta, right? But then if it's AC in the context of like a bigger word like próbować, which means to try, you would think that it's like próbowam, próbowasz, or próbowa. But that's not true. It changes to próbuje, próbujesz, próbuje. And these seem to be with ać verbs that have like other stuff attached to it. And I don't know if it's like an exception-based thing or if it's just something that you have to memorize, but that was quite confusing for me as well. But it gets way worse. So on top of that, if you want to say past or future tense, these verbs are also gendered.
Excuse me, it's ma'am. It is ma'am.
When you're trying to say Polish correctly, it feels like every single word is conjugated, which makes it so difficult to put a simple sentence together. Whereas in Spanish, you have genders for the nouns, and depending on what the noun is, you have to change the adjective. I'm sure I'll get it over time because I'm seeing a lot of progress already, but every time I talk to my Polish friends, they say that instead of trying to systematize it in your brain, you just have to expose yourself to the language and remember how everything is said, and then you'll eventually get it, which in my opinion is a very inefficient way to set up a language, going back to some of my complaints on how the Polish language is set up. As I learn more about the language, I think once I get to like a B2 level, then I'll have maybe ways that you can make the language a little more efficient. But for now, I'm still trying to learn as much as I can. What's funny to me is that I tell people that I'm learning Polish, right? I'll say something to my Polish friends, and every time I tell them how to say a word, how I learned it's correctly supposed to be said, they'll even argue amongst themselves about how it's supposed to be said, and sometimes they'll even get it wrong. So people say that I'm crazy for saying that the Polish language is kind of a mess, but the Polish people themselves are the ones saying this, and you guys can't even seem to agree on what's the right way to say things. Perfect example is when you use the E or the L sound. When that goes at the end of a word, the L sound sounds just like a regular E. So I had two of my Polish friends arguing on how to say it. I just thought that was funny. So I've done this before, right? I learned Spanish at the age of 25 and I got to a low B1 within 3 months, but then I got to B2 within a year. After a couple more years there, I finally got to around a C1 level. I ran a business in Spanish. So I have experience learning a language from zero, and I'm essentially applying all of the same processes to me learning Polish now. I was consistent for the first month doing a bunch of Rosetta Stone. Essentially, it's like a higher level of Duolingo. And Rosetta Stone was really good in the beginning to introduce me to basic verbs, basic nouns, numbers, days, colors, and they focused a lot on pronunciation. But I found that they weren't really teaching me anything related to grammar. So think about pronunciation. When a lot of people learn languages, they don't put any effort into the accent or pronunciation, and I think this is a big mistake. I think you have to focus on pronunciation from the beginning because once you develop bad habits, they are very hard to correct. One of the compliments that I get the most about my Spanish is that my accent is so good. Now, I don't speak exactly like a native speaker, but I don't sound like a total gringo either. When I was back in Colombia, I had much more of a paisa accent, but now I would say my accent is neutral. But everybody tells me, like, when they hear me speak, they can't believe that I learned it only in like 3 years and as an adult. But that's because you have to put so much emphasis on the accent and pronunciation from the beginning. So now I'm pretty good at reading Polish, even though I don't know exactly what they mean, because I put a lot of effort into learning the alphabet and make sure I'm saying everything correctly. Obviously, I'm not saying it super perfect. I think it's close enough where people can see that I'm making like a valiant effort. Also, because of the fact that I have access to Spanish, Chinese, English, and Hokkien, all of those sounds, I'm able to hear the differences. For example, between the Z's, you have Z, Zh, and Zh. There are very slight differences and it changes like where you put it in your mouth. But this last month, I've really been putting a lot of effort into learning as many verbs as possible and learning basic grammar. So I have all of my Polish notes in here. I also make like flashcards. Yeah, I'll put some B-roll on top so you guys can see it. But I also bought this book, Krok po Krosku, and this book I highly recommend if you're trying to learn Polish. The book is pretty much all in Polish with some English words. It really puts you in the mindset of trying to understand everything in context and thinking in Polish, and it just exposes you to a lot of Polish from the beginning, which I really like. And also they touch a little bit about grammar, about conjugations. I think it's a pretty good foundation for anybody who's trying to get into the language. You really have to put effort, and I think because I already have language learning experience, I was able to connect a lot of the dots. But I understand if you only know like English and you're trying to get into Polish, this book might be a little intimidating, but so far out of all the resources I've seen, this is really good. On top of all that, on my phone, I make Anki flashcards. I did the same for when I was learning Spanish. And pretty much any words that I learned from the book or I run into in the wild, I try to ask for the definition of it. I put it into flashcards, and I make sure to do flashcards every day for like 10 to 20 minutes. You'll be so impressed by how many words you can learn just by doing flashcards every single day. And I say to learn any skill, it's very simple. You just need concentrated practice every single day for a long period of time. It's better to practice 15 minutes every single day than to practice once a week for 3 hours, because your brain needs to sleep in order for you to remember all of these words. I'm just a very disciplined person, so I'm able to always make time for it every single day. So because I've been studying a lot of verbs, I can make basic sentences now, even though I get very, very nervous and I have to think about what I'm going to say before I say it. When somebody asks me a question in Polish, because Polish people speak so fast, I can only make out maybe a couple of the words from there, especially because I don't really know the conjugations yet. So when I try to respond, I have to really think about it, and it takes me like a few seconds. But usually when the Polish people see me thinking, they'll just switch to English, so I don't really get that much of a chance to practice. But that's why when I travel through Poland and I go to some of the smaller cities where they only speak Polish, I like it because I get to practice my Polish a lot more. I've been pretty much learning A1 all by myself. I'm gonna be starting A2 lessons at the end of January, so I think that's gonna severely speed up my progress. It's been very, very fun. I love learning new languages. I love how rewarding it is. Just Poland in general, the more that I learn about the country, the more I learn about the history and the language, the more I really love it and I want to stay here. I'm gonna make a progress video every single month so you guys can see how much I've been learning and the issues that I'm facing at that time. I highly recommend that you guys watch this video next. Dziękuję I do jutra.